It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the sleepy suburb of Oak Ridge Hills, where the streets seemed almost frozen in time. The houses stood in neat rows, freshly painted, trimmed to perfection, each lawn an immaculate testament to the community's pride. Yet there was something off about the morning, a flicker in the air, as though a storm was coming. Though the sky was clear, the sun blindingly bright, the trees standing still as if waiting for an unseen command. Across the street, Karen Miller stood at her window, her eyes narrowed in a mix of irritation and disbelief. She'd seen it the night before. An American flag, huge, unmissable, hanging high outside the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. It was not a flag she'd seen before, old, faded at the edges, and billowing in a way that seemed almost aggressive. It didn't fit. Not here. Not in Oak Ridge Hills, where every lawn was trimmed to exact specifications, and every flagpole gleamed with precision, a gleam that said, "We're perfect. We belong." This flag, though, it felt like an intrusion, like a whisper of something raw, something real, something unpolished. Karen frowned. Her hand tightened around the cup of coffee in her hands, steam rising into the air, almost mocking her frustration. She had been a part of this neighborhood for years, had carefully curated her life in the pristine confines of Oak Ridge Hills. No one disrupted the peace here. No one dared make a statement that couldn't be cataloged and tucked neatly into the acceptable column. She set the coffee down, her gaze still fixed on the flag. There was something off about it. The bright colors against the pale blue sky felt too bold, too out of place for this place. It wasn't an ornament for the yard. It was a declaration. She hated it. With a deliberate motion, Karen picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. The line clicked, and the operator answered. Her voice was calm, almost indifferent. "Yes, Mom. How can I assist you today?" Karen didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what needed to be done. "I'd like to report a neighborhood violation," she began, her voice sharp and commanding. "There is a flag outside a residence on the corner of Oak and Cherry, and I believe it's in violation of HOA rules." There was a pause on the other end. "A flag, Mom. What seems to be the problem with it?" Karen's grip on the phone tightened as her eyes flitted back to the offending symbol. "It's inappropriate. It's too large. It's unsightly. It's also unapproved. It needs to come down." She felt a thrill of vindication. After all, she was right. She had always been right. Karen prided herself on knowing when things didn't fit, and this flag. This was not a fit. It was a disruption to the pristine rhythm of her perfectly controlled world. She would make sure it was gone. The operator hesitated. "Okay, ma'am. I'll send an officer to check it out." As Karen hung up the phone, a shiver ran down her spine. Something felt unsettled, but the feeling was fleeting. She would make sure that flag was taken down, and everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be. Her world would return to order. But little did she know, that flag was more than just an eyesore. It was about to stir up something far deeper, a storm that would reshape Oak Ridge Hills forever. And by the time it was over, Karen would learn that some things are not so easily erased. The morning sun filtered through the large bay window, casting a golden hue across the living room of Karen's meticulously kept home. But as she paced back and forth, a faint unease lingered in the air, curling like smoke around her. The flag, still flying defiantly across the street, nagged at her thoughts. It was too much. The colors were too vivid. The wind whipped it with such force that it appeared to strain against the very air, like it was fighting to be seen, to be acknowledged. Her phone vibrated in her hand, shaking her out of the growing unease. It was a reminder, a call from her neighbor's daughter, Rachel, confirming another volunteer event at the community center. It should have been a normal, comforting routine, but Karen's gaze kept drifting toward the window. Her fingers twitched. She picked up the phone again, her thoughts already racing ahead of her. No, this couldn't go unchecked. With one swift motion, she dialed the non-emergency number again. This time, her voice carried a sharper edge, as if she were taking command of something she had every right to control. The operator picked up immediately. "Hello, this is Officer Daniels from the Oak Ridge Hills Police Department. How may I assist you?" Karen barely allowed him to finish. "I'm reporting a disturbance again. That flag, it's an eyesore. It's unapproved for our neighborhood." She wasn't asking. She was demanding. "Ma'am, you've already mentioned the flag. What seems to be the issue with it exactly?" Karen's teeth ground together. "It's too large, and it's inappropriate for the community. It's causing a disruption. Please send someone out." The officer's voice was professional, but there was something faintly uncertain in his tone. "I'll send someone to check it out, ma'am. We'll have someone come by shortly." She hung up before he could say anything else. There was no need for further conversation. This was going to be handled. The flag would come down, and her perfect little neighborhood would be restored to its pristine, silent harmony. But as she sat back down, her thoughts churned. It wasn't just the size or the visibility of the flag that bothered her. There was something about it that felt personal. A memory tugged at her, a name she couldn't quite place. Her mind skittered away from it, unwilling to entertain the thought. No, it wasn't the flag that was the problem. It was the way it made her feel. Unsettled, like the stillness of the morning had been shattered by something loud, unexpected. Minutes passed, stretching into an uncomfortable silence. And then, the faintest sound, a car pulling up to the curb. Karen's heart skipped, and she rose to her feet. Through the blinds, she saw the police cruiser, its headlights still dim. The officer parked, got out, and approached the front door. His uniform was crisp, and his boots clicked decisively against the pavement. She could feel the weight of the moment. Her fingers trembled, but she clenched her fists, steadied herself. The flag would be gone by noon. It had to be. As the officer knocked on the door, Karen's pulse quickened. He spoke briefly with someone inside the house, but she couldn't hear their words. Her gaze locked on the flag again, fluttering in the breeze like a challenge. It was a matter of minutes now. Her stomach knotted. This would be over soon. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that the flag wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol, a memory woven into every fiber of its being. And as she steeled herself for the inevitable removal, a part of her was already beginning to realize this wasn't just about a flag. This was about to become a battle of respect, a battle she never expected. Officer Marcus Daniels had worked Oak Ridge Hills for years. He knew the quiet streets, the manicured lawns, the perfect little homes that seemed to whisper about their owners' need for order. His job rarely took him outside the bounds of the expected. A missing lawn gnome here, a misplaced trash can there. It was the kind of place where trouble was hard to find, where people greeted each other with pleasantries and nodded toward the well-kept homes. But today, something felt different. As he drove down Oak Street, past rows of pristine houses, his eyes landed on the flag. It stood out like a sore thumb against the otherwise serene scene. The wind whipped it fiercely, causing the edges to snap, its fabric straining against the pole like it wanted to escape. It was almost aggressive. He parked in front of the house with the flag, his car's engine sputtering to a quiet stop. The officer's radio crackled to life, but he silenced it with a tap. His instincts were already on high alert. This wasn't just another complaint. Something about this situation felt off, a flicker of unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He reached for the door handle, his fingers cold despite the warm morning sun, and stepped out of the car. As he moved toward the front door, he caught a glimpse of the woman across the street. Karen. Her arms were crossed tightly, her face a mask of unrelenting disapproval. She watched him closely, her gaze fixed on the flag, and then shifted to him. It was as if she had already passed judgment, expecting him to side with her. "Officer Daniels, I'm glad you're here," she called out, her voice carrying the sharpness of someone used to getting their way. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You called it in, I take it?" he asked, maintaining his distance. "Of course I did," she said, a bit too quickly, her lips curling into something that could almost pass for a smile. "You're going to take care of this, right?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded politely and walked up the porch steps, his boots creaking softly underfoot. The door opened just as he reached the knocker, revealing a woman in her late 30s, her face etched with lines of quiet concern. "Can I help you, officer?" Rachel Mercer asked, her voice soft yet steady. "I'm here to look into a complaint about the flag outside," Daniels replied, glancing over his shoulder toward Karen, who was still standing at the curb, her arms folded tightly. Rachel's expression faltered, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "I see. Please, come in." She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Daniels hesitated for a moment, sensing the tension in the air. But he stepped inside, and immediately the stark contrast between the outside world and what lay within became apparent. The house was decorated with a mix of old military memorabilia and warm, lived-in comforts. Photographs of a younger man in uniform adorned the walls. A wheelchair sat beside a worn armchair, and the smell of fresh coffee hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of roses from the garden just beyond the window. Daniel's eyes drifted to the man in the armchair, a weathered face that spoke of battles fought and memories long buried. "Dad, we have company," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm. The man looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to focus on the officer standing in front of him. His hand gripped the arm of the chair, his fingers thick with age and wear. He cleared his throat, the sound rasping as he spoke. "What's this about my flag?" Charles Mercer asked, his voice gruff but steady. Daniels paused, unsure of how to approach the situation. But as he looked at Charles, truly looked at him, he could feel the weight of the man's presence, the history that radiated from him like the worn fabric of the flag outside. This wasn't just a complaint. This was something deeper, something with more weight than he had anticipated. "We had a call about the flag, sir," Daniel said slowly. "It seems there's been some concern about its size and visibility in the neighborhood." Charles chuckled softly, a dry, almost bitter sound. "A flag, huh?" He wheezed as he adjusted himself in the chair, his eyes never leaving the officer. "That flag flew over my unit's base in Vietnam. It flew over my friend's casket, and now it flies here. If that bothers anyone, they're welcome to try and take it down." The words hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with a sense of history, of sacrifice, that neither Karen nor the officer could have possibly understood. As the silence stretched between them, Rachel stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about the size of the flag, officer. It's about the man who asked for it to be there." Daniel stood still, the weight of the moment sinking in. He was about to make a decision, one that could change the course of this quiet neighborhood, one that would reveal the truth behind the flag. And yet he had no idea what the real story was or how it would unfold. The room seemed to close in on Officer Daniels as Charles Mercer's words hung in the air. It wasn't just the flag. It was the man sitting before him, the man whose very presence filled the room with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. His eyes, clear and piercing despite the weight of years, seemed to drill into Daniels as though seeing straight through him, through everything into the soul of what this situation truly meant. Daniels shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his gaze flicking between Charles and the flag outside, now fluttering in the breeze like a battle standard that refused to back down. He could feel the weight of something ancient in the room. History, sacrifice, loss, all wrapped up in that simple, weathered flag. And Karen, standing across the street, still watching with arms folded, had no idea what she was about to unleash. Charles leaned forward in his chair, his hand gripping the armrest with surprising strength for a man who had lived so much. There was a stillness in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "That flag," Charles said again, his voice gravelly but firm, "is not just a piece of cloth. It's a piece of me, and a piece of every man who bled under it, every friend I lost, every nightmare I carry. If it disturbs someone, they should ask themselves why it does. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. Daniels had heard stories about veterans, about the burdens they carried, but standing here, with Charles in the flesh, it felt different. There was something almost palpable about the loss in his voice. The officer had no words to offer, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he even wanted to speak. What could he say? How could he justify taking down a flag that represented so much? Rachel, standing beside him, didn't look at her father, but instead stared down at her shoes, her hands clasped tightly together. "We've tried to explain it to the neighbors," she said quietly, almost apologetically, "but it's hard for them to understand. They see the flag as just a symbol. They don't see what it means to us." Daniels took a slow breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He had been a cop long enough to know that appearances often deceived. What he thought was a simple complaint was rapidly evolving into something far more complicated. The flag wasn't just a political statement. It wasn't just about the size or visibility. It was about something deeper: legacy, sacrifice, honor. He cleared his throat, his voice softer now. "So this flag means more than what it seems. It's part of your family's history." Charles gave a single nod, a quiet confirmation. "My son died in combat. My best friend died in the same place. This flag is the only thing left of them, the only thing that speaks for their sacrifice. And if that offends someone, they can come talk to me." Daniel stood motionless for a long beat, processing. The image of the flag snapped into focus in his mind, not as a symbol of divisiveness, but as a silent monument to those who had given everything. The wind caught the edges of the fabric again, making it billow dramatically against the pole. It felt alive, like it was standing guard over something precious. But then the reality hit. He was standing in the middle of a neighborhood dispute. Karen, across the street, her judgmental eyes fixed on the house, was not interested in history or sacrifice. She only wanted order. Her order. And she wasn't going to back down. "Karen won't let this go," Daniel said, his voice breaking through the silence. "She'll push harder than you think, if she gets enough people behind her." "I don't care about her," Charles interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "She doesn't matter. What matters is what that flag represents. If you take it down, if you let her win, then everything it stands for is meaningless." Daniels looked at Rachel, who had finally raised her eyes to meet his. Her expression was a mixture of worry and resolve, as though she already knew the battle was about to escalate, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Is there a way we can handle this without it turning into a fight?" Daniels asked, his mind racing through options. Rachel shook her head slowly, her lips tightening into a thin line. "I wish, but when you're dealing with people who don't understand, there's no reasoning with them. Not anymore." The officer stepped back toward the door, his mind whirling. He hadn't expected any of this. He thought it would be simple: make the flag come down, solve the problem. But now, it was about something much more significant than just a yard ornament. As he stepped out onto the porch, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The decision was no longer his to make. This was bigger than just him or Karen or the flag. This was about something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. And as he turned to look at Karen, standing motionless across the street, her face set in stone, he realized just how much this had already spiraled beyond anyone's control. The quiet of Oak Ridge Hills, so long a hallmark of its charm, now seemed ominously fragile. Officer Daniels stood on the front porch, his gaze locked on Karen across the street, whose eyes had never left the Mercer house. She had remained motionless, her arms still crossed, her face a mask of determination. The tension between her and Charles Mercer, a veteran whose very existence seemed to challenge the norms of her pristine world, was palpable. Daniels felt a strange, suffocating weight in the air, as if something important was about to break, but no one could see it coming. He wasn't sure what had shifted inside him, but the certainty that this was more than just a neighborhood dispute had become undeniable. A part of him, the part that had served in the police force long enough to see how things spiraled out of control, knew that Karen's complaints were only the beginning. She was a force of nature in Oak Ridge Hills, and when she set her mind to something, she usually got what she wanted. But now, Daniels was faced with a dilemma. He couldn't help but think about the veterans he'd met in his career. The ones who had fought, bled, and suffered for their country. And here, in a quiet neighborhood, a flag was all that remained of their sacrifice. How could he stand in front of Charles Mercer, a man who had given so much, and tell him his symbol of honor had to be taken down because it was too large, too visible? He glanced back at Charles, who was still seated in the living room, a resolute figure in his chair. Rachel, standing beside him, her face a mixture of concern and resolve, caught his gaze. Her eyes seemed to silently plead for understanding, for a solution that wouldn't tear their world apart. But Daniels knew that the clock was ticking. Karen wouldn't wait long before rallying the neighborhood, and once she had the support of her tight-knit circle, there was no telling how far she'd go. From the corner of his eye, Daniels noticed movement. A few more neighbors gathering at the end of the cul-de-sac. It was subtle at first, a head peeking around a corner, a couple of children staring out from behind windows. But it was clear now. Karen was building momentum. He turned back to Rachel. "You know Karen will go to the HOA with this," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "And if it gets to that point, this won't be just about the flag anymore. It'll be about the entire neighborhood. The whole community could be pulled into this." Rachel's lips pressed together tightly, her hands trembling slightly. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And once she has everyone on her side, it won't matter what we say. She'll get the flag taken down. She'll make sure of it." Daniels stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Across the street, Karen's figure remained unmoving. He could feel her eyes boring into him, silently demanding that he act, that he enforce the law. But what law was he supposed to enforce? What was the right thing to do here? The wind picked up again, causing the flag outside the Mercer house to snap violently in the air. For a moment, Daniels could swear he heard a faint whistle, like a mournful sound that carried across the neighborhood, echoing the cries of soldiers lost to history. It was the wind, of course, but the sensation was strong enough that it rattled him, made his skin prickle with something he couldn't quite name. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Enough of this nonsense." Karen's words were sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. She was no longer standing across the street. She had crossed the road and was now on the Mercer property, her heels clicking with authority on the driveway. Daniels didn't move as Karen approached, but his heart picked up its pace. He could see the fire in her eyes now, a desperation to win, to impose order at all costs. The calm, composed Karen from before was gone. This was the Karen who would not tolerate anyone defying her sense of propriety. The Karen who could turn a quiet street into a battlefield if she had to. "This is a simple matter," she said, her tone icy. "We follow the rules in Oak Ridge Hills. The flag is a violation. I'm giving you a chance to resolve it peacefully, officer. You can take it down now, or I will take it to the HOA myself." Her eyes didn't flinch from Daniels's. She was unyielding. But as she spoke, there was an odd tremor in her voice, a faint hint of something that wasn't as confident as it seemed. Daniels could almost feel the trembling foundations of her resolve, but Karen wasn't about to back down. "Karen," Daniels said, his voice steady but firm, "you don't understand what's at stake here. This isn't just about rules and regulations. This flag represents something deeper than you think. The man who fought for it, the man whose blood it's soaked in. This isn't just a decoration. This is about sacrifice." Karen's expression hardened. "I don't care about the story behind the flag. This is a neighborhood, not a museum." Her voice was filled with a mix of arrogance and frustration. I'll take it to the HOA, and they'll back me up." Daniels met her gaze for a long moment, something dark flickering in his chest. He was a cop, but even now, in the thick of this standoff, he felt the deep pull of history, of what had been lost. He had to make a choice, and in doing so, he was about to set off a chain of events that would engulf this peaceful street in a storm of controversy. As Karen's figure receded into the distance, heading for the cul-de-sac, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. He could almost hear the flag snapping in the wind, a reminder that battles didn't always end with a single act of defiance. The air in Oak Ridge Hills had changed. It was no longer the calm, well-manicured neighborhood where children played in yards and neighbors exchanged pleasantries over the fence. Now, there was a low hum of discontent, a barely contained energy that crackled beneath the surface of every conversation. The flag outside the Mercer house had become a symbol, one that sparked anger and pride in equal measure. Officer Daniels stood on the front porch, his gaze fixed on the flag snapping in the wind. It was as though the house itself had become a battleground, the flag at the center of an invisible war. The neighborhood had been quiet for so long, and now, in the span of a few days, it had become ground zero for a conflict that was about to explode. He could feel the weight of every decision pressing on him. Karen had already threatened the HOA, and if this went that far, the consequences could be devastating for the Mercer family. The flag wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol of everything Charles had fought for, everything he had lost. And yet Karen's determination was unshakable. The neighborhood was her kingdom, and she would not let something as disruptive as a flag challenge her authority. Rachel Mercer was pacing inside, wringing her hands as she glanced out the window every few moments. The fear in her eyes was palpable. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice trembling. "I can feel it. Things are going to get worse. I just know it. If the HOA gets involved, it'll be over. It'll be a public spectacle. People will take sides, and we'll never be able to recover from it." Daniels turned, meeting her eyes. He had been a cop long enough to understand the weight of her words. This wasn't just about a flag anymore. This was about community, about the fragile fabric of a neighborhood that had once been united, now torn apart by something as simple as a piece of fabric. "We don't have much time," Daniel said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Karen is going to escalate this. I know her type. Once she gets the HOA involved, it's a matter of time before she has a full-blown campaign on her hands, and once the neighbors start choosing sides." He didn't finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air between them. Rachel looked out the window again, her eyes searching for something, anything that might give her hope. But the only thing she saw was Karen, standing at the corner of the street, talking animatedly to a group of neighbors who had gathered in front of their homes. The scene reminded Daniels of a lynch mob, the way Karen was rallying them, convincing them that what she was doing was for the good of the entire neighborhood. He could feel it too. The pressure was building, and it wasn't going to stop until it had exploded. Just then, a car turned onto the street. It was a sleek, black SUV, a vehicle Daniels recognized all too well. It was the HOA president, and with him was a man in a sharply pressed suit, the kind of person who only showed up when things had truly gone off the rails. The car slowed as it passed by, and the two men locked eyes with Daniels. The message was clear. They were here to settle this. Rachel's face drained of color as she saw the car pull up. "It's happening, isn't it?" she whispered, almost to herself. Daniels didn't answer. He was already walking down the porch steps, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the SUV. The door opened, and the HOA president, a man named Greg Winters, stepped out, adjusting his tie as though preparing for a speech. Beside him was the man in the suit, tall, well-groomed, and exuding an air of authority. Daniels knew this wasn't just some petty disagreement. This was the start of something much bigger. Greg approached him first, his handshake stiff and formal. "Officer Daniels, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. His voice was smooth, his smile tight and rehearsed. "I'm sure we can resolve this matter quickly. It's just a matter of following the rules after all." Daniels forced a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sure it's just a matter of perspective, Greg." His gaze flicked to the man beside Winters, who was already eyeing the Mercer house with a cool, calculating look. "Let's take a walk," Daniels suggested, leading the men toward the porch. As they walked, the air seemed to grow heavier, every step a slow march toward an inevitable confrontation. The man in the suit, whose name Daniels didn't yet know, spoke up as they reached the porch. "I understand the situation, officer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had dealt with far worse. "But rules are rules. The size of that flag exceeds the guidelines set forth by the HOA. It's not just an aesthetic issue. It's a violation of our community standards." Daniel's eyes narrowed. A flag represents something far more than aesthetics or rules. It represents sacrifice, honor, something that can't be reduced to measurements on a piece of paper. Greg Winters smiled thinly, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of Daniel's response. "I understand your point, but we have to consider the greater good of the neighborhood. A flag that large, so visible, so out of place, is not just a distraction, it's disruptive." Daniels could feel the weight of the words pressing on him. Karen's influence was here, in full force. She had already begun to sway the HOA, and now, with the support of Winters and this suited figure, they were moving in for the kill. Rachel stood inside, her hand resting on the window pane, watching helplessly as the forces that had converged on her home grew more insistent. This was no longer a conversation. It was a battle. And it was about to get worse. The calm before the storm had finally broken. The moment of delicate balance that had existed between the Mercer family and their community had shattered. And now, standing on the porch with the HOA president and his lawyer, Officer Daniels felt the weight of what was coming next. He wasn't sure who would win this battle, but it was clear someone was going to lose everything. The flag, once just a symbol of pride for Charles Mercer, now represented something else entirely, a point of division that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of Oak Ridge Hills. The wind had picked up again, sending the flag snapping in the breeze like a defiant roar. Daniels could almost feel the pulse of the neighborhood around him. The air was thick with anticipation, as if every single person had a stake in what happened next. The HOA president, Greg Winters, stood rigidly beside him, his face taut with practiced politeness, but Daniels could sense the tension beneath the surface. The lawyer, a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, watched the Mercer house as if it were some kind of nuisance to be eradicated. The man's eyes flicked to the flag, then back to Daniels, as though waiting for him to make the first move. "You know, officer, this could all be settled so easily," the lawyer said, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "All it takes is for the Mercer family to follow the guidelines. Remove the flag, and everything goes back to normal. A simple solution to a simple problem." Daniel's teeth ground together. It wasn't a simple solution. It wasn't even close. To Charles, that flag wasn't just a decoration. It was a testament to the sacrifices of soldiers who had given their lives, and it was the only part of his son he had left. "I don't think you understand what you're asking," Daniels replied slowly, his voice carrying the weight of his growing frustration. "This flag is not just about the size or the visibility. This is about history, honor, sacrifice. You can't simply erase that because it doesn't fit into your neatly organized view of the world." The lawyer smirked. "Sacrifice doesn't change the fact that the flag violates our community standards. This isn't about sentiment, officer. This is about keeping the peace." Daniels felt his patience slipping. He could hear Rachel's voice in his head, the quiet desperation in her words just moments ago. "This is going to get worse. It's going to destroy everything." She was right. No matter what happened today, nothing would be the same again. The very soul of the neighborhood had already been fractured. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw Charles Mercer standing in the doorway of the house, his figure solid and unmoving. His face was hard as stone, his eyes fixed on the flag outside. He looked every bit the man who had fought in wars, who had given everything and lost so much. But now, all he had was that flag. "We need to make a decision now," Greg Winters said, cutting through the tense silence. "I'm not here to drag this out. We've given the Mercers enough time to comply. If they refuse, the HOA will take action. A vote will be scheduled immediately." Daniel's heart sank. A vote meant a public spectacle. It meant pitting neighbor against neighbor, dividing a community that had once been close-knit. But what could he do? As a cop, he couldn't just ignore the laws, even if they felt wrong. He had a duty to uphold the rules, but he also had a duty to protect the heart of the community and the people who had built it. "I won't let you do this." Charles's voice broke through the tension, low but resolute. He stepped forward, his face full of quiet fury. "You don't get to dictate to me what's right. You don't get to erase my son's sacrifice." The lawyer took a step back, visibly taken aback by the raw emotion in Charles's voice. Greg Winters' smile faltered, and for the first time, Daniel saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Please, Charles," Rachel said from behind him, her voice pleading but firm. Let's talk about this. We can find another way." But Charles didn't move. He was a man who had seen too much, lost too much. And this flag, this symbol of everything he had given, was not something he could just take down because someone didn't like it. Not now, not after all these years. "You want to tear this family apart for a flag," Charles said, his voice gaining strength. "But it's not about the flag. It's about who I am, who we all are. And I won't let anyone erase that." Daniels could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The weight of the situation had grown unbearable, and for the first time, he realized that the decision was never his to make. This was no longer a matter of following the rules. It was a matter of standing up for what was right. Greg Winters opened his mouth to respond, but Charles raised his hand, silencing him. "If you want to tear us apart, you'll have to go through me." The air around them thickened, the weight of the moment settling into every corner of the street. The quiet hum of Oak Ridge Hills was gone. Now only silence reigned, broken only by the flag snapping violently in the wind. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Then, without warning, the sound of a car door slamming shut echoed down the street, breaking the fragile stillness. A figure appeared at the end of the block. It was Karen, striding purposefully toward them, flanked by several other neighbors. The fight was no longer just about a flag. It was about to become something much bigger. And the real battle had only just begun. The crowd had gathered. At the end of the cul-de-sac, Karen's sharp heels clicked against the pavement, the sound ringing in the tense silence. She was flanked by a handful of neighbors, their faces set with determination. The kind of determination born from a need to restore order, even if it meant tearing down what others held dear. She had succeeded in rallying them, and now, with every step she took toward the Mercer house, her resolve hardened into something dangerous. Officer Daniels stood frozen on the Mercer's porch, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an unbearable storm cloud. He was no longer a bystander. He was a participant in a war that no one had wanted to fight. His eyes flicked from Karen's advancing group to the still figure of Charles Mercer, who was standing tall despite the uncertainty swirling around him. "Daniels, you need to make a choice," Karen called, her voice sharp and cutting. "Either you uphold the community's rules, or you let this," she gestured toward the flag, "destroy everything we've built. We won't stand for this anymore." Her words were loaded with the kind of self-righteousness that could blind someone to the bigger picture. But Daniels, standing at the crossroads of right and wrong, could feel the truth of it in his gut. It wasn't about the flag. It was about power. It was about control. And now, as Karen's supporters pressed forward, he realized that the real war wasn't about a flag at all. It was about the soul of Oak Ridge Hills. He turned his gaze to Charles, whose eyes burned with a fierce, unrelenting fire. The old veteran wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, erase his dignity. This flag represented everything he had fought for, not just in war, but in life. His son's sacrifice. His own. "I will not let them take my son's memory from me," Charles said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice was steady, though it carried the weight of a man who had already lost too much. "You're fighting me for this flag, but it's not about the flag. It's about what it stands for." Daniels felt something stir within him. The gravity of Charles's words was undeniable. This wasn't just a matter of rules. It was a matter of honor, of fighting for what was right, even if that fight seemed hopeless. The veterans he'd known throughout his career, the ones who had carried the weight of history on their shoulders, had never given up, no matter how impossible the odds. Charles Mercer was no different. The sound of Karen's voice broke through his thoughts. "We don't have time for this," she snapped. "Either you act now, Daniels, or I will." At her words, the crowd behind her began to murmur, their voices rising in support. The pressure was mounting. Daniels could feel it tightening around him, a noose that threatened to pull him in one direction or another. His hand twitched toward his badge, then paused. What was he supposed to do? Could he stand by and watch as a community was ripped apart? But then, just as everything seemed to be spiraling out of control, a loud, unexpected voice rang out from behind him. "Enough." The crowd fell silent, the voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Daniels turned sharply, his heart pounding. It wasn't Rachel's voice. It wasn't Karen's. It was the voice of a neighbor he hadn't expected to see. A man named Samuel, an older gentleman who had lived on the block for decades. Samuel had always been the quiet type, the kind of man who kept to himself. But now his voice carried an undeniable authority, a weight that made everyone stop in their tracks. "I've been watching all of you, standing here arguing over something that doesn't matter." Samuel's eyes swept over the group, his gaze as steady as a rock. "This flag may be big. It may be visible. But so what? What matters isn't the flag. What matters is the heart of this community. And if we're willing to tear each other apart over a piece of cloth, then we've already lost." Karen's jaw clenched, but she didn't say anything. The other neighbors stood in stunned silence, as if Samuel's words had struck them deep. Charles, standing in the doorway, finally spoke. "I didn't fight for a flag. I fought for the right to stand, to be free, to make choices. And if we lose that freedom by tearing each other apart, then we've lost everything." Daniels could feel the weight of those words sink in, not just for him, but for everyone standing there. This wasn't just about a flag. It was about something far bigger, the values that had built Oak Ridge Hills, the respect that had once defined the neighborhood. Karen stood motionless, her face a mix of frustration and disbelief. She had believed in her own righteousness so fiercely that she hadn't considered the possibility of anyone challenging her vision of order. But Samuel's words had struck a chord. The neighbors were no longer just following her lead. They were thinking for themselves. And that, Daniels realized, was the turning point. With a heavy sigh, Karen finally spoke, her voice low and strained. "Fine, but mark my words, this won't end here. I'll make sure of it." She turned on her heel, her followers following reluctantly behind her. The crowd dispersed, leaving the Mercers standing in the doorway, their lives forever changed by the battle they'd just fought. Daniels turned to Charles, who was still standing firm. He could see the weariness in the old man's eyes, but there was something else there too, a quiet victory. "I think," Daniels said quietly, "you've won this one." Charles didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "It's not about winning, officer. It's about holding on to what matters." As the last of the crowd drifted away, the flag outside the Mercer house continued to flap in the wind, not just as a symbol of defiance, but as a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with conviction.